What I'm proposing to do tonight is to look at the events in Ukraine and see why Russia is so interested in Ukraine, and then see how that fits in with the events which are happening, which, as we know, is the forming of the 2 feet of Nebuchadnezzar's image. And then we'll go to the Middle East and look at the Middle East and see this ISIS and what it represents and how that fits in with Bible prophecy. And then a brief look at Israel, and then a final look at Britain and the EU. So, we know that the events that are taking place at the moment in Ukraine and in the Middle East are really all part and parcel of God's working among the nations to form Nebuchadnezzar's image. We know that this image has never existed in the past. It has been built up over the centuries, millennia, but never has it stood upon 2 feet. And that is what we're seeing form now, the feet part, in order that this image might stand up and come against the nation of Israel. And so we're seeing the process of the nations being sorted out into their respective feet. And at the same time, that those feet are connected to an image stands with a golden head. It has 2 thighs, and as in the past the 2 thighs represented a north-south power in the Middle East, so again we're seeing such a north-south power being formed in the Middle East. So it's quite an exciting period that we are living in at the time of the end, and this image has got to stand upon its feet, and then we'll know that it will come against the nation of Israel, and there it will meet the force of the Christ and the saints, and we pray, our Heavenly Father, we may be there to save Israel in the time when they have been defeated by this Gogin force and their power broken, and they cry out to their God, and that little stone power smites the image upon its feet, and the kingdoms of men disappear and are replaced by the kingdom of God, which will fill the earth and rule. God's rule will be centred in the Lord Jesus at Jerusalem. So, Bible students have been watching the affairs of Europe for a long time. Brother Thomas, in the preface to Alpes Israel, has these fairly well-known words: "The future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times because they are predicted in the scriptures of truth. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things as at present constituted is at hand. The long expected but stealthy advent of the King of Israel will be on the eve of becoming a fact." So, why is Russia so interested in the Ukraine? Why is it interested in expanding its empire? Well, the Ukraine is actually the birthplace of Russia. It's also the birthplace of the Russian Orthodox Church. So Ukraine has a tremendous meaning to the Russian people. We believe that it was Noah's grandson, Taras, who was the one that moved into this region, left his name to the river Taras and Terastopol, and out of him grew what was to become the Russian nation. It takes its recent history from coming together of 2 great cities, Novgorod in the north and Kiev in the centre of Ukraine as we know it today. And these 2 cities, as it were, merged, and Rubrik sent Oleg to take Kiev, and though it was a capture of the city, it wasn't a destruction of it, and it's described as the coming together of 2 great cities. And Kiev really flourished because it was on this trade route for the Vikings to come down to Constantinople, which was the centre of the world at that time. And Igor, the son of Rubrik, he is looked upon as the true beginning of the Russian princely line. In 988, Vladimir took over the throne, and he became Christian, Greek Orthodox. The day he married the emperor's sister, he was baptized, and he and his new wife came back to Kiev and converted the Kievians to a Greek Orthodox Christianity. And from that sprang eventually the Russian Orthodox Church. In its height, it was a big kingdom. It stretched all over that territory. That's the outline of Ukraine today. So it expanded greatly and reached its zenith in about 1132, when the Mongols came along, swept in and began pushing upwards from the bottom, and it shrank mightily, not much bigger than Kiev, than the Ukraine of today. And as a result of the invasions, Kiev eventually fell in 1240, and the church, which was the Russian church, moved up to Vladimir in 1299, and then established itself in Moscow in 1322, and that really made Moscow the new centre of Russia. And around that centre, the Russian nation developed. But as I say, its origins, and they trace its origins to this Kievan Rus. Rus is a shortened name of Tyrus, the grandson of Noah. It would be a long time, 1654, before Ukraine would come back, and Kiev would come back under the control of Russia. And 300 years later, in 1954, there was a great celebration in Ukraine of the fact that marked the 300th anniversary of this Treaty of Pereslav. And as a gift to the Ukrainians, the Russian leader, Khrushchev, handed Crimea to the Ukrainians. Before then, Crimea was under the direct control of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine had its independence, but was part of the Soviet states. So this was a gift, giving back Crimea as a birthday present to mark this 300th anniversary of the Kiev and Ukraine coming back under Russian control. And of course, at the time, it didn't make much difference because they all spoke Russian. Nobody could foresaw and see in 1954 the great changes which would take place 40 years later. 24 years on, there was another big celebration in the region, in Ukraine, and that was to mark the 1000th anniversary of the time when Christianity came to Kiev. And interestingly, this is from a history magazine written at the time, 1988, and the artist has painted there with adult baptism. Interesting. But this is what it said in this article inside this Christian history magazine. It's finally come, the observance that millions of Ukrainian, Belarusian and Russian Christians have been waiting for, the millennium of the Christianization of Rus, when the Grand Prince Vladimir ordered the people of his kingdom to be baptized into the Orthodox Christian faith, and personally oversaw the baptisms of the majority of the people of Kiev, the capital of his realm. But what it went on to say was made an interesting observation which we can easily forget when today we see church and state in Russia working hand in hand. But in 1988, that was not the situation. And it went on to say, but the arrival and celebration of this millennium is heavily laden with irony. Probably the chief irony is the fact that the Soviet Union, a zealously atheistic government, is endorsing, even funding and promoting the most spectacular of the many events worldwide that are being dedicated to the millennium of Christianity in Rus. Well, that was 1988. 3 years later, then the Soviet would fall and be broken up. And so this map, all these coloured states here broke away from Russia, and that was in the words of Putin, 2005, he said that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. And bearing in mind that that century, the 20th century he was talking about, was the century that saw 2 world wars, saw the Holocaust and all that. But in Putin's eyes, in Russia's eyes, the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe. And Putin has set his heart upon rebuilding, pulling back all those offshoots which were at one time part of the Soviet Union. And it's incredible, as I said, to see the change today when church and state do work hand in hand. The priests attend political happenings and the politicians attend religious happenings. Putin is frequently seen with the religious leaders. But, as I say, he has set himself the task of rebuilding that power again. And this is chap Mark Leonard of the European Council Foreign Relations, and it writes and says that Putin sees himself as an invaluable historical figure who shall be responsible for upholding the pursuit of Russian greatness, no matter what law or border stands in his way. Moscow is preparing for a lengthy confrontation with the West. After years of defending the status quo, Putin seems to have decided that he is better served by overturning it. Russia has a genius for revolutions, but while the earlier revolutions were about changing the leadership of the country, Putin's revolutions aims to correct the order about him. That's his view on it. He wants to put things back to how they were. And so he is spending a lot of money. Russian defence spending rose 5% to 88 billion, devoting a greater share, larger share of their GDP on military than the US for the first time since 2003, which this Turkish newspaper added is a big sign that Russia is getting ready for some expected tough days in the near future. And again, we see the concentration, especially since Russia annexed the Crimea, where she's got her fleet based. She's developing her navy, and we know that fits in with what scriptures tell us from Daniel chapter 11, that she's to come forth with many ships. And so it's so wonderful to see this drive to build up her navy in the Black Sea. So, with that background, we'll just look at the troubles in Ukraine. They are in the eastern part of the Ukraine where the troubles are, and some of these towns have already declared they want independence through referenda they've held. They want to join up again with Russia, as has Crimea. Now, if we just put on that the modern map, as you can see, they're in the eastern area. What we have to really superimpose upon that map is the number of Russian-speaking people. These are the percentage of people whose first language, natural language, is Russian. And you can see 86, 82%, dropping down to 46% in the centre there. Russian is their natural language. And then it tails off 24% in the centre area and only 3% in the west. And so there is a pull of these Russian-speaking areas to want to go back and attach themselves to Russia rather than be attached to Ukraine. And this is where Putin is using his subtle tactics of sending in troops and forces to stir trouble in this eastern area of the Ukraine. Now, the Crimea has already fallen into Russian hands, and at the moment the Russians are in talks with the Chinese to put a bridge across this very narrow strip that separates them, because otherwise the only way is to come through Ukraine or come by sea. Obviously they don't want to come through Ukraine, so this is a very real project to build that bridge to link them to Russia. Sevastopol is where the deep water port is. This is Russia's only warm water port. They can use this all the year round compared with the other ports which they have which get frozen in the wintertime, so there's a very important one to them. And they are concentrating on, as I say, reinforcing their fleet there. Now, the other prize that fell into Russia's hands through taking Crimea was the mineral deposits which lie in this area. The area of the Black Sea around here is known to be very rich in hydrocarbons. It's been likened to the North Sea, so vast reserves. Now, while Crimea belonged to Ukraine, Russia only had a fairly small area of the Black Sea, which was theirs to do exploring in, whereas the main part where most of the minerals, or the hydrocarbons are, was Ukrainian. But you see, with that change, now Russia has said all this area is ours, and so you can see that she potentially is sitting on a big supply, a future supply of hydrocarbons. And there is another spin-off as well, because Russia is very keen on building a pipeline called the South Stream, which runs down through Russia and was projected to come down into Turkish waters to come across to Bulgaria and onwards in order to avoid going through Ukrainian waters. Well, that's now all changed because this is now Russian. She can shorten that pipeline considerably by going straight across. And there's a lot of controversy about this pipeline. The EU's not happy, but the ultimate destination is Austria. And Austria and Putin, they've just had meetings and signed an agreement, and it looks all set for this to be built, which will take Russian gas straight into the heart of Europe, to Austria, where it gets distributed. Ukraine now has a new president. Petro Poroshenko is known as the Chocolate King because he built his fortune on confectionery. He is both leaning east and west. He wants to get on with Russia because a lot of his people are Russian-leaning, but he also wants to attach Ukraine to the EU. And he said he's going to go down that pathway of Ukraine joining the EU. Of course, that causes Putin to jump up and down. Putin doesn't want to see the Ukraine disappear into the hands of the EU. That's why he's using his skills, sending tanks across the border, and that was in June, middle of June. They shot down that transport plane, didn't they? All 49 people were killed, and that was shot down with a Russian anti-aircraft missile. So he's been putting pressure and continues to put pressure by sending his troops undercover into this region to foment trouble. And at the moment, the president of Ukraine seems powerless to be able to do anything about it. But Russia has just played its big weapon, and that's the oil weapon. This was a cartoon from, I think it was 2008, but exactly the same thing is applied, because the gas that flows through and the oil that flows through Ukraine goes to the EU ultimately. And the Ukrainians have always had an argument with Russia about how much they pay for their gas. And back in 2010, they did a deal and had a big discount, 30% discount, through agreeing to allow the Russians to continue to lease the base at Sebastopol for another 30 years. And there was another smaller discount that was negotiated at the same time. But it meant that they paid $234 per 1,000 cubic meters of gas. Now, when Ukraine, when Crimea fell into Russia's hands, Russia told Gazprom, look, you shouldn't give that discount anymore because we're not leasing the bases of the Ukrainians anymore. So get rid of that discount, get rid of the other discount, and the prices suddenly ran to 485. And there was a lot of outcry. It's such a big hike in prices. And so what Russia said, well, if you pay your debts, and according to Gazprom, their debts amount to about $4.5 billion of what they owe in back payments. If you pay your sums up, clear that, well, we'll bring the price down to 385. And the Ukrainians, guided by the EU, said, no, we're not going to pay any more than 326. And that's where the negotiations finished. So Gazprom says, right, we're going to turn off the tap. And so on June the 16th, the tap was turned off. But it doesn't actually get turned off because, as I say, the majority of the gas that is running through these lines, its ultimate destination is going to Europe. And so what Russia has done is to reduce the amount of gas that is going through by the amount that Ukraine normally takes, so that only Ukraine then should suffer and the rest of Europe shouldn't suffer. That's the theory. Actually, at the moment, Ukraine is in a good position. She has reserves of gas to last about 10 months. And so it should take her through into the winter time. That's when the crunch will really come. So we just have to wait and see what happens. But all this upset has had a tremendous effect on the exchange rate, and their currency to the dollar, which was at about 0.12, suddenly nosedived right down to 0.75, and it's bounced up to about 0.85. So it's lost, a third of its value. And that means that any imports are very expensive. And this has really hit our brothers and sisters living in Ukraine. In fact, at Rugby, we're having a collection for them. Their standard of living has plummeted. There's great scarcity because things can't come from Crimea. Things aren't coming from Russia because Russia is using this as a weapon against the Ukrainians. So life is very difficult for them, and some of them who live in the West, where all the troubles are having to leave everything and try and find somewhere to live in Kiev, where things are a bit more settled. So very tough for our brothers and sisters. As far as I know, there are none living in Crimea, but life in Crimea has been turned upside down because no longer is Ukraine the official language, Russian is, and so all the documents, all the law that applies is Russian law, not Ukrainian law. All the passports have to be Russian, and so a lot of the banks are still shut because of the tremendous turmoil at this change. So pretty tough all round in Ukraine and Crimea. Now, we can see that is all part of this shaking of the nations into the right feet. And we use this at the prophecy day, but we can see just how much the EU has moved towards Russia and is forming the Western foot. So in 1991, when Russia broke up and Russia was reduced to that outline there, these were but it wasn't even the EU, was it? It was the EEC. It only had 12 members. And then over the years, and especially in 2004, big expansion, and then finally today, we can move on another 10 years, 28 members, and we can see just how much it has pushed up against the Russian borders. And Ukraine is one of these countries which lies between the two. Now, Russia hadn't taken this line down. She has wanted to expand and she is wanting to build the equivalent of a Russian EU. And it started with the customs union, which embraces Russia, Kazakhstan, and she had hoped Ukraine, and Belarus, and as from a couple of months ago, it now incorporates Crimea. Just at the end of last month, they signed the foundation treaty, which would then move that on to the next stage, and not just be an economic union, but would be the Eurasian Economic Union. That's what she's aiming to set up, and she's hoping that the little states of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and Armenia are hoping that Ukraine will join, but that's where the tussle is going on. The other two potentials are Moldova, that little chunk in the middle there, and Georgia. So we can see there's still a lot of movements to come, but what Russia is wanting to do is to, as I say, build up her equivalent of the EU on this side and then the EU on that side, and this will form the 2 feet. Now, with Bible in hand, we would expect that there are countries like Ukraine which will belong ultimately to the Russian foot rather than the European foot. If we go back in history, no, get there in a moment. So these events which have been taking place in Europe are part of the wake-up call, and hence this cover on the New Statesman that seeing Russia and its aggressiveness, its assertiveness again, and the question is it time to rearm? And the answer is yes, it is time to rearm. There are troubles ahead. And that is very much connected with Bible prophecy. Now, if we were going to take a reading, we would have had Daniel chapter 2, but I'm sure you know it all off by heart. And we know that we're in this latter phase, the iron and the clay feet being formed. Iron, obviously, we associate with Rome. It's there in 2 aspects, in a military aspect and in an ecclesiastical aspect. I say that because in the time of the rulers of Rome, the emperor was in charge of the military, the army, as well as the head of religion. So the iron of Rome covered both sides. Now, in Russia, we see that the 2 sides of a strong military power and a strong religious power are welding what welds Russia together. Now, we haven't quite got there in Europe. Under the new Pope, there is this move for the Roman Catholic Church to play a more prominent role in the affairs of Europe. And I think we're reaching a time in history when men and women are looking to some rock to cling on to, with all the problems that they are facing, that humanism doesn't provide the answers. And there does seem a general drift now for religion, church-going, to be rising in Europe. We know that in the time that lies between the return of the Lord Jesus and the coming of the nations against Israel, maybe 10 years, we've looked at that in the past, that will be time when Europe will band together. And we can see, beginning very shortly, I think, a drive for Europe to increase her armaments. At the moment, she's been dependent on America. America is drifting further and further away. And Europe will realise that she has to arm herself to be a strong power. The clay we associate with humanism, man, Adam. And again, we see very much in the EU, though we have it in Russia, this strange mixture of humanism with authoritarianism. democracy and authoritarianism. Very much in the events that are taking place in the EU at the moment, isn't it? Who has the power to control who is going to be appointed to these various jobs? Is it going to come from the people, or is it going to be imposed by unelected leaders, or is it going to be by elected leaders? So when we see this strange mixture of iron and clay, and one can discern it in Russia as well. You have Putin, very authoritarian, but he has his Duma, his parliament, who gives that sense of democracy. People do have some power and influence. But one of the effects is that, in the words of Joel chapter 3, individual nations are realising that they haven't the power or the money to stand on their own feet, as it were. They have to join up with others. And that's why we're seeing so many nations willing to give up so much in order to be part of a bigger group. Now, Britain doesn't feel that way, and we know that she's got another independent role to play. But, you know, we are in this situation where weak nations become strong by joining up with others, and there is this general drift now to say we've got to have weapons, we've got to beat our ploughshares into swords, pruning hooks into spears. So the situation at the moment lies there. If we want to know which belong to the eastern foot and which to the western foot, our only guidance is to go back in history and see where the division was under the Roman Empire when it had its two legs. And the division ran through the Balkans there. So that's Ukraine, that's Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Cyprus, and that's Turkey there. And so it would seem reasonable that the future division will run somewhere, if not the whole of Ukraine, will run partially through Ukraine. Because in 395, this was barbarian country, and there were no nations for the Romans really to conquer there. So we haven't a lot of guidance, but only just a projection of the line upwards there. And so that would involve great changes from the present, that there are a lot of nations which at present are in the western foot, which are going to be moved to the eastern foot. And it's very interesting that those nations of Romania and Bulgaria and Greece and Cyprus have all got financial problems. And if the EU is going to devote money to building up its military, it's not going to have money to throw at these weaker countries. And so if there is a euro crisis, and it is on the cards that the drive by France and some of the other countries to weaken the discipline on the euro will lead to a collapse of the euro, then there could be financial trouble. It's not too difficult to see that Russia is waiting in the wings, that when trouble comes along, she will be prepared financially to pick up the pieces to take these countries back under her control again. And so, I'm afraid the map slides across a bit, but I foresee a dividing line there in Ukraine and these other countries eventually coming under the control of Russia. But as I say, we're seeing that shaking of those nations before our eyes, but at the same time, this is what is so interesting, is we see the forming of the two thighs. Now, in the past, that represented the Greek Empire and its division into the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, north and south of Israel. And later on in Daniel, he becomes the king of the north and the king of the south. Now, in the image that stands up, we know that the south doesn't belong to the image, and so perhaps it's not quite strictly right for me to say the division of the two thighs, but I believe that we're going to have a similar division, a north-south division in that region, as part of the preparation of the standing up of the image. And that's why it's so interesting to see what is happening at the moment in that region. And to understand what is happening in that region, we have to look at the makeup of the nations in the region there. And this is showing the countries which are Shiite, and these countries here in the lighter shades which are Sunni. Now, Iran, of course, is not an Arab country, but works with the Arabs and wants to dominate the Arabs. Where is she there? 90% Shia. Iraq, where all the problems are at the moment, is 63% Shia, so still a majority of the Shia, and the Sunnis are in a minority. And apart from Yemen, all these have a Sunni majority. Now, when the British and the French divided up the area, it went very arbitrarily across these divisions of religion, and we're now reaping the benefit. So the present situation is that we have suddenly emerged like the horsemen of the apocalypse, the ISIS power sweeping in and establishing control over a very big part of this region. They took Kirkuk and then lost it again. The Kurds now control that. But suddenly, this boundary between Syria and Iraq has disappeared. And what is being formed is a grouping of religious people. The ISIS are Sunni, and they are ignoring any boundaries that are there. Now, over here is the Syria, where the conflict has been going on. We're now in the 4th year. It's estimated that 170,000 have died. Another estimate put it almost at 250,000. 3 million have fled Syria. 4 million are displaced within Syria. So it's a huge humanitarian disaster in Syria. And Assad has just recently won the election, uncontested virtually, and he now has another 7 years in office. And a year ago it seemed as if he was about to fall. Now he seems very strong in this part of Syria where that's his original territory, homeland as it were. And he has used chemical weapons and bombs filled with shrapnel to decimate many of his fellow countrymen in Aleppo and this region here. And to begin with, there were a whole number, hundreds, of different opposition forces that came into Syria to try and claw back Syria and defeat Assad. But as time's gone on, those forces have amalgamated. And very much ISIS has now come to the fore as the amalgamation of these many forces. Now, ISIS stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Sometimes the word Syria is the old-fashioned word of al-Sham, which is the ancient name for Syria. But it's also known as the ISIL, Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. Levant is just the rather old-fashioned word to describe the region from Syria down to Israel and into Iraq. That was the Levant, sometimes including Egypt and Turkey. Now, ISIS was set up in 2004 following the invasion by Bush and Blair into Iraq. So ISIS was set up, an al-Qaeda party, a Sunni Muslim party, to fight against the West and to support Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni in a Shiite country. So he and his henchmen held power, but they were a minority religion. And al-Qaeda supported Saddam Hussein. And ISIS was set up within Iraq to defend Saddam Hussein. of course, Saddam fell. ISIS continued, but last year there was a big breakup between the current leader of Al-Qaeda and the ISIS leader. And in fact, ISIS were outlawed by Al-Qaeda. That didn't faze them. They continued to go from strength to strength. There was an interesting article in The Guardian on the 15th of June, and it soon became clear that in less than 3 years, ISIS has grown from a ragtag band of extremists to perhaps the most cash-rich and capable terror group in the world. That's quite a thing. When they took Mosul in the beginning of the month, they robbed the banks, and that gave them access to $1.5 billion. They've been busy looting archaeological sites which abound in Syria. And just from one site alone, it's estimated that they got $36 million just from one archaeological site, and there are many they have been looting. And they now control the oil fields in eastern Syria. And the income they're getting from that, nobody can calculate. But they have got money pouring in. So that's hence the Guardian's assessment that they're probably the richest terrorist group in the world and capable of doing all sorts of things. We know how brutal they are. They practice extreme Shia law. The pictures about a fortnight ago, wasn't it, when it was very reminiscent of the Nazis and the Jews, digging pits, making the Shia captors lie down and then just machine gunning them down. They practice chopping off hands, beheadings, hangings, crucifixions. So they terrorise the inhabitants of the countries they haven't yet taken, the towns they haven't yet taken. So when they came to Mosul, which was the second biggest city in Iraq, all the Shia inhabitants, the soldiers, just took off their uniforms and fled, because they knew that if they were taken, they would just be summarily shot. And in fact, 1,700 of them weren't they? And it's estimated that 500,000 people fled from Mosul. Mosul's a big city, and gone into refugee camps. So at the moment, it seems a very strong power. Now, whether it will last, we cannot tell. But there is an interesting scripture we're going to look at in a moment. If we think back just over a year with the Muslim Brotherhood, they seem very strong in Egypt, in Hamas. Turkey was wanting to join up with them so that the whole of that side of the Mediterranean could become Muslim Brotherhood. And in just a few months, it's virtually collapsed and disappeared with the change in Egypt and the effect that has had. Hamas has been weakened. Turkey has decided not to go with Muslim Brotherhood anymore. So things can very rapidly change. I suspect that they won't in this case. So at the moment, they have established this area of their control, and they intend it to be an Islamist state. It's had the effect of dividing the area up. The Kurds have had relative independence for a number of years, and this has strengthened their position because Baghdad is fairly weak, and so the Kurds have taken the opportunity. There are Kurds in Iran, and there are Kurds up in the north in Turkey. And they have long wished to join forces to form a Kurdistan involving part of Iran and part of Turkey. So they've established themselves there. The ISIS have established themselves in the centre as Sunni power. And in the south here of Iraq, then at the moment the Shiites reign. And over on this side, It seems that Assad is establishing his territory there, and so it could well be that this territory, instead of following the neat Iraq-Syria lines, will fall into smaller states. Now, Iran, of course, is not happy with ISIS because Iran is Shia. These are Sunni. But she hasn't a lot of influence over them and doesn't know how to control them without full-blooded invasion, which doesn't seem on the cards at the moment. Now, although these are Sunni, and to the south Saudi Arabia is Sunni, there doesn't seem any love lost between the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia and the Sunnis up here. And the Saudis have said, we don't support them. And really, the nations just don't know what to do with this sudden emergence of power there. But just picking up on the Kurds, because there's an interesting link with Israel, Kirkuk has come back under Kurdish control, and there are important oil fields in this region, and the Kurds have been developing those oil fields over the past few years. And in order to export their oil, because they haven't got access to the sea, there is an existing pipeline that was built a few years ago, 600 miles long, which takes the oil from the main oil fields here, the main Iraqi oil fields, which are now fallen under Kurdish control instead of Baghdad's control, and it's shipped to this Turkish port, Shahan. And just about a month ago, they shipped a load of oil, and a huge tanker was trying to find a country that would buy their oil, and it was Israel that eventually said, yes, we'll buy it. And last Friday, the tanker docked at Ashkelon and unloaded its oil. And the Israelis and the Kurds have always had a friendship, and one can see that in future this could be quite a profitable thing for Israel, because they can ship to Israel. Israel has its own pipeline that crosses the country, the TIP line, to Eilat, where tankers from Asia can come and load up. So the Kurds here can sell their oil to Asia via Israel. At the moment, they're producing about 120,000 barrels a day, which is a fair amount. Of course, the money is going into the Kurds' pocket, not into the Baghdad government's pocket, so there's a lot of ill feeling there. But Israel is quite happy to stand by her old friends. So, back to ISIS. Where does this feature in Bible prophecy? Well, the significance lies in the fact that they took Mosul. Mosul is the second biggest city in Iraq. And if it seems to be the place that they are choosing to be their centre. This was a map that was in Debka, and it had the title Al-Qaeda Iraq, ISIS, takes Mosul as cornerstone for Islamic State. So it would appear that they want to use Mosul as their centre. Now, what's significance about Mosul? Well, it's a very big city. It's on the Tigris River. You've got the right coast and the west coast, the left coast there. But if you can see, it says Nineveh ruins. This is the ancient Nineveh. Mosul today is the ancient Nineveh. And of course, Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. We're told in Genesis that Assur went and built Nineveh, and that started the Assyrian Empire. And the word Assur occurs many times in Scripture as Assyria. Now, why is that important? Well, if we go back to that rather obscure prophecy of Balaam, before Israel had ever entered the land, Balaam's last message, final message to Balak, when he takes up his parable, he's talked about the time when Israel's king will be greater than Agag, Septuagint translates Agag by Gog, and paints this final picture of a conflict between Amalek and Israel's king. One has to read between the lines to say that. So he looks on Amalek, takes up his parable and said, Amalek was the first of the nations, but his latter end shall be that he shall perish forever. And his final words are that ships shall come from the coast of Kittim, shall afflict Asher, and shall afflict Eber. He also shall perish forever. Now, if we understand that to be applicable to the Gogian forces, Nebuchadnezzar's image standing up, representing the latter-day Amalekite, the one who is against Israel, because that's what the Amalekites wanted to do, to wipe Israel off as they came out from Egypt. Then, putting together what we know from Daniel chapter 11, he shall come with ships, many ships. The Gogian forces come with many ships, and it seems reasonable that they would take Kittim, Cyprus, as a necessary step to establish their power, and this is where the British have their naval bases. And then it's the words from Balaam that he then goes to take Asher, then points to the fact that at Asher there is a power that isn't in the hands of Iran. Because Iran, Persia, we know, is one of the companions of Gog. So it seems there is a force there that needs taking in order that they might come down to Israel. And then they come down into Egypt, and then it says it goes back. And Eber, of course, is the ancient name, or the name for Israel. Eber is the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Abraham. Eber means the crosser over, the region across the river, because Abraham, when he came down from Haran, crossed over the Tigris and over the Euphrates, on his way to Israel. And Hebrew means a descendant of Eber. So, it fits in with this picture of a power there that needs to be taken, so that could represent ISIS continuing there, and before it comes to take Eber, the Hebrews, but meets their defeat and perishes forever. So if we look at the fuller picture, we see Iran working in the region, just waiting for the Americans to come out from Afghanistan in order to go in to Afghanistan and probably into Pakistan. She has been quite active in Iraq until now, but very active in Syria. And just recently, because Turkey has given up on the Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey has mended fences with the Iranians. And so what Iran is wanting to do is to build up a King of the North power there. But it may well be, from what Balaam says, that there will be a little hole in his territory of a power which is not friendly to Iran, hostile to her. At the same time, in the south, we see the Gulf states working together. They're proposing to set up a 100,000 strong army by next year. They're talking to Jordan, they're talking to Egypt to bring them within this confederation. Again, we see nations having to come together to make themselves strong. And so it's not difficult to see the enlargement of the influence of Saudi Arabia to Egypt and to Jordan. We know how Israel has been working with Jordan, has been working with Egypt, and so would be a power that would work with these people, has been in the past. The only problem at the moment is Yemen are desperately trying to get rid of the terrorists in Yemen in order that Yemen might become part of the Gulf Union. So, being exceedingly brief, but we see the powers dropping into place with the European Union pushing that way, Russia building that way, Iran building her empire there, and Saudi Arabia building her empire there. We know in the final analysis that these two work together with this to come against Israel and to come against Egypt. These are hostile to the other countries. So we briefly come to Israel, and I just put this cover on. This goes back to 2002, where the Time magazine asked the question, is anti-Semitism on the march again? And in the 12 years since that cover was produced, we can very definitely say yes. And some recent quotes that in Europe, Jewish life is unsustainable due to rising anti-Semitism. The Jews are having to disguise that they are Jews because they're so persecuted. A quarter of the world is anti-Semitic. The European parliamentary elections worry the Israelis because of the large rise in anti-Semitic parties which were sent to the new parliament. And the Hamas-Fatah unity government is something which extremely worries Israel. It's only been going the last 3 weeks or so, but it's beginning to crumble, and especially with the events of the kidnapping of the 3 young Israeli students, this seems to be bringing about a breakup of this unity government before it's even started. And Israel is using the opportunity to mop up Hamas on the West Bank. Virtually all the Hamas operatives have now been arrested by Israel. What she'll do with them, one of the thoughts is that she'll send them back to Gaza, and that will break up the influence of Hamas on the West Bank, which Israel so much fears. But I just wanted to pick up on the Pope's visit not long ago. Again, with the theme of anti-Semitism, there was not one whisper from the Pope of protest against the efforts of the Palestinians to take over the nativity story and make it have no connection at all with the Jews. These were Palestinians. And you can see we've got 3 popes here and people with crosses there. But Joseph and the baby are wrapped in the traditional kafayas of the Palestinians, so beloved of Arafat. He was always wearing that. So very distinctly Palestinian, nothing to do with Jews. At Christmas time, they openly say Jesus was a Palestinian, Joseph was a Palestinian. I'll say there was opportunity for the Pope standing in front of it to say something, but he chose not to. And on his photo stop at the wall, we know that the wall only is in places where there was so much trouble in the past of firing weapons that they have to build a concrete wall. The other sections are merely fencing. And the opportunity was taken. You can see this young girl with a Palestinian flag being pushed rather reluctantly, if you look at her face, so that there is the Palestinian flag in front of this writing, which Bethlehem looks like the Warsaw Ghetto, which of course there's absolutely no connection between the two at all. The Jews were there under fear of their life. The Palestinians are walled in because of their hostility to Israel. And then the most strange coming together, the Pope calling Perez and Abbas to the Vatican for a day of prayer. But it's interesting that Perez is, when he was brought up in Poland, unlike virtually all the other Jews there, he was sent to a Jesuit convent school until he was 9, when they moved to Israel shortly afterwards. And so it's interesting how Perez has always, of the Israelis, been quite happy for land and property to be handed over to the Roman Church. And now I know that information, I can understand why this is. But it's all part of Israel making the wrong friends, and I see time has gone. We've looked at this passage before, but God makes it quite clear that they're making the wrong friends, making friends with the Vatican, making friends with Russia, it will only be grief to them. It won't bring them the stability that they desire. So just finally, just 2 more slides. Scotsit could lead to Brexit. In other words, Scottish independence could lead to Britain leaving the EU. If the Scots vote to leave the UK in September, that could trigger a chain reaction which leads to the rest of the UK quitting the European Union. This is a threat to British pro-Europeans, which British pro-Europeans need to take seriously, given that a Scottish independence vote is quite possible, though a yes still has less than 50% of the chance. So it's on the cards that they do vote to leave, but it says that if they do leave, then that would have profound repercussions, because the Labour Party, which of course is pro-Europe, 41 members come from Scotland. If Scotland breaks away, then those 41 members won't be in the English Parliament, whereas the Conservatives would only lose 1 member. So it would tip the balance. And we know how tomorrow and Friday are going to be critical days for Cameron. He fighting his last stand against this man being appointed President of the European Commission. He is an out-and-out Europeanist. He won the Charlemagne Prize back in 2006. He will take Europe down a pathway which Britain doesn't want. And those of you who take the Daily Telegraph will have seen this cartoon. If you know the incident the day before of a mother rebuking her child because he'd gone onto quicksands and got half buried. So that was taken, you see the stars. So it's quite good. But time has gone. Another interesting chart that it is just how competitive Britain is now. This is looking at 2004, 2014, and adjusting the figures so that America is at 100%. Shows that the United Kingdom is the cheapest place to manufacture in the Western Europe. There's the Netherlands, there's Germany, there's Italy, there's Belgium, there's France. So great opportunity for Britain, independent role, to rebuild herself up. And so, brothers and sisters, it's so exciting that in God's mercy, God has called us, opened our eyes to see these wonderful things and to know that this day surely is so close. Because as we know, that the Lord Jesus has to come to call his household before all these other events unfold. So I'm just going to leave you. I'll just take a couple of minutes, for these are some of the recent cartoons, which the cartoonists are so wonderful at how they just get their finger on the pulse.